Hello and welcome to Inside China. I'm Shelley Zhang. On our last show, we featured the book The Pitfalls of Modernization by noted economist He Qinglian. In 2003, 5 years after its first publication, a revised edition called China's Descent into a Quagmire was published in the United States by Broad Press. While the original book suffered under the Chinese Communist Party's heavy censorship, this new version is based on updated information and includes more compelling evidence. In today's program, author He Qinglian joins us to talk about China's descent into a quagmire.
I rewrote the prologue and epilogue and also added a new chapter. These three parts contain many of my own reflections and theories about the Chinese economic reform. I added some information about changes after 1989. Especially about the organized crime, black markets, state-owned enterprises, etc. I also removed some previous content to make the total length the same as before, but updated at least 1/3 of the information.
So you just mentioned that you added a new chapter. What's it about?
It is about the famous article called General Analysis of China's Social Structure Evolution. I wrote about the differentiation of social classes and the new hierarchy of each class after the reform. I remember that after I published this article in a magazine called Book House, the magazine's chief editor joked, "Right now all of us are using your book to check what rank we are in." In the article, I also mention a concept that the political and economic elites and think tanks are joining forces while the workers and farmers are marginalized.
What do you mean by marginalized?
If one wants to have a position in the society, first of all, he or she must have an income to maintain a decent life, even if they live meagerly. People I refer to here are those who have been gradually alienated from the social structure and have no forms of income. For example, the farmers in China are called by direct translation three no people. This term is coined by the Chinese regime and refers to people without legal papers, permanent jobs, and settled residences. As you can imagine, if a person doesn't have these three basic things, how can they live in society? Therefore, workers with no jobs can only live in slums and can't afford an education for their children. We can regard China as a modernized train. Those political elites control the train, with economic elites and think tanks in the first class hard berth and soft berth. The middle classes are in the relatively good hard berths, while lower classes in the social ladder are on the hard seats. As for the three no people, they have already been thrown out of the train, leaving them without a connection to the developments of the whole society. In the age of Mao, China was led by the working class and based on the worker-peasant alliances. At that time, however, workers enjoyed their high political status. Jiang Zemin wanted to change that theory and so put forward the three represents principle. A manager of a big enterprise in Shanghai had told me that for decades the CCP claimed it would represent the people's interest but never fulfilled. Then why did the CCP always talk about it? There is a moral function in it. We have money, and this makes us the representatives of the advanced productivity and culture. Besides the government, only knowledgeable elites who stand for our interests can speak on TV and newspapers.
Does that mean the Chinese Communist Party leans toward the political and economic elites instead of the working class and peasants?
Yes, you can say so. There is a very obvious phenomenon emerging after 1989 in China. The political and economic elites took various measures to create policies in their favor, like the small car policy, real estate policy, telecommunication policy, and so on. As long as these policies are for the good of these main forces, the government will issue them promptly and decidedly. As for the policies concerning the populace, it takes more time than you think to operate and implement. It was in 1993 that China set up its policy of macro regulation and control. Before that, the central government delegated powers to lower levels and cut profits to allow some groups more benefits than others. After 1993, however, the government wanted its money back from the populace by setting up a medical insurance reform, endowment insurance reform, employment system reform, and educational system reform. We can conclude that the reforms were actually a process for the regime to seize the state property.
Some people think that the wealth gap is an inevitable problem, even for the U.S. If you overemphasize to eliminate this gap, it may return to the common rice pot system, where there's not enough food to eat. What do you think about this problem?
Yes, I agree that each society has the problem of a wealth gap. But the more important thing is that the whole society needs to have a system to help the poor people. To learn about a society, it is important to observe how poor the poor people are, instead of observing how rich the wealthy people are. After I came to the United States, I found that it was not hard for poor people to survive. They can get their basic food by using the food stamps provided by the government. They can also get subsidies for their children. Therefore, it is still not that difficult for families who have many children to survive. There is no social insurance system, unemployment insurance, or social relief system in China. If the poor lost their jobs, they might have no means of livelihood. This is completely different from the U.S. The wealth gap in the United States has developed during the process of competition and the marketing system for about 200 years. The poor and the rich are at the same standing point. The public schools are free, and children from low-income families can apply for student loans or even a scholarship to pay their tuition fees. While in China, there is no such system to help those poor people, and there is no equality from the start. In these short 20 years, the Chinese regime has taken every penny of the peasants' hard-earned money. Chinese state property is taken from its own people's meager savings. This reform deprived people of their money again, and this makes the poor people become poorer. If we look at reasons and consequences of China's wealth gap, it would be reasonable to say that the wealth gap in China is completely different to the one in Western countries. I rewrote the epilogue, The Loss and Gain of China's Reform, to point out directly that political and economic, as well as think tanks, are the full beneficiaries of this reform. The majority of the people, middle class and lower classes, especially workers and farmers, are actually deprived.
What do you think about Deng Xiaoping's policy of letting some people prosper before others?
We all had a fantasy about the reform at first and believed that the declared aims of the CCP would be achieved. Some people should be allowed to get rich first so that they can bring along those behind them with the goal of common prosperity. Since I came to the United States, I have been reading some political literature that talks about the reforms of developing countries. I found two commonalities in these countries. The first is that these countries were established through wars. Through war, these political powers were able to utilize and move society's resources. The other is that these countries always had the power of controlling the whole society. From this perspective, the Communist Party is more powerful than any party in the world. So from this point, we can see that during this process of turning toward economics, the main use of power is to provide for the needs of individuals or specific interest groups. If we think that this reform is to satisfy the needs of Chinese people, then it means that we are not clear about the totalitarian characteristics of the regime.
You've pointed out so many problems of China's economic reforms. What are the solutions to these problems?
China's problems are too complicated to be solved by anyone. There is at least one way to help, and that is a reformation of the political system. I stated in my book that although these problems were in the field of economy, the roots are political. Therefore, political reform is the only way for China now. There are two problems of political reform. One is about timing. The policies in the 100 Days Reform of 1898 will no longer be useful. This is called time cost of reform. That is to say, the earlier there is a reform, the better. Second, although political reform can't handle all of the problems in China, it is at least offering a possibility. When Empress Dowager Cixi refused reforms during her time, she said that people did not deserve it because they were considered to be of low quality. They, however, neglected one point, which is that democracy is a process of learning and practicing. It is useless to just agree in theory. Chinese people's level of intelligence won't necessarily be lower than those of Americans. It is better to let people learn in practice through the process of democracy than never allow democratization. Why is the Chinese Communist Party reluctant for political reform? There was a saying prevailing in the 90s. It was called, "Fighting corruption will kill the party, but not fighting corruption will kill the country." If you struggle against corruption, you will find that almost all the members of the CCP are corrupted. Without fighting corruption, there is no future for a country that is controlled by the Chinese Communist Party.
Now, in that interview, Ms. He Qinglian told us that the book, The Pitfalls of Modernization, changed her life. Join us next time to hear the story of how she fled China. Thanks for watching.